The Syrian crisis has turned into one of the most critical foreign policy challenges of the Islamic Republic of Iran. In spite of the fact that Syria and Iran do not share common borders, Syria has been critical in implementing Tehran's initiatives in the region, especially in regards to Lebanon and Israel. 4 years into the bloody civil war, over 160,000 casualties, and the changing status of the Assad regime, Tehran perceives threats to its influence in the region and its power. Ever since the victory of the Islamic Revolution in 1979, Iran has been threatened with attempts of regime change. It became particularly critical after the neoconservatives took power in the Bush administration and the introduction of the so-called Greater Middle East Initiative. The initiative was seen in Iran as an attempt to overthrow regimes in the Middle East that were opposing Israel and the United States policies. It was to begin with Yasser Arafat's Palestinian Authority and continue with Iraq, Syria, and Iran. The initiative did not achieve all of its stated goals and was shelved quietly after George Bush. Yet, after the dramatic developments in the Arab world, namely the Arab Spring, many among the Iranian opposition overseas believe, or rather hope, that after Assad, the Islamic regime too would fall. This perception seems to be shared by the leader of the Islamic Republic and his hardline followers, especially the revolutionary guards and the individuals directly responsible for Iran's foreign policy in the Levant. The Syrian regime has been an important ally of Tehran. Immediately after the victory of the Islamic Revolution, Saddam Hussein's forces invaded Iran. During the 8-year war that followed, all the Arab regimes supported Saddam, albeit some covertly. Syria was the only exception. Damascus remained the only Arab regime that supported Tehran in its war with Iraq. Also, shortly after the revolution, Israel's occupation of South Lebanon provided the pretext for the revolutionary government in Tehran to get involved in Lebanon and eventually create the formidable military and political force in Lebanon, namely the Hezbollah. Hezbollah does not take orders from Tehran, but it is a vital ally on the Israeli borders and in Syria. It can be argued that the Islamic Republic of Iran and Israel have been involved in a proxy war during the past 3 decades. Through its formidable influence in Washington, Tel Aviv has successfully managed to inflict substantial damage to Iran. Tehran, on the other hand, has benefited from Hezbollah's activities in Lebanon and on the Israeli borders. Tehran's relations with Hezbollah are critically dependent on cooperation of the Syrian regime. If the pro-Iran regime in Syria falls, it would substantially undermine Iran's influence and maneuverability in the region. From Tehran's point of view, fall of the Assad and dismantling of the entire regime has other far-reaching consequences, not only for Iran, but for the Middle East region as a whole. As the war continues, Syria's territorial integrity is increasingly endangered. This would certainly be seen as a threat to Iran's security in the region in the long run. Syria's fragmentation will affect other neighboring countries, including Iraq. Any attempt by Syria's 2 million Kurds for independence and creation of a Kurdish state would have serious consequences for Iraq and Iran, both of whom have large Kurdish populations at their shared borders. Both Iraq and Syria have large Kurdish, both in Iraq and Syria, the Kurds already enjoy a semi-autonomous status. Tehran is also concerned about identity politics that have been on the rise in the region. Iran is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country. Though predominantly Shiite, most of Iran's borders are inhabited by Sunnis and ethnic minorities, such as the Kurds, the Baluchis, Arabs, and Turkmen. Shiism is the ideology of the Islamic Revolution and has remained a determining factor in the formulation of the Islamic Republic's foreign policy. Shiites are a small minority in the 1.6 billion Muslims of the world. Tehran is concerned about the fate of the Shiites in Syria, Lebanon, the Indian subcontinent, Iraq, and the rest of the Persian Gulf. There has emerged a rivalry between Riyadh and Tehran that is playing out with deadly consequences in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. This is not a rivalry that Tehran would benefit from or seek. Ever since the revolution, the Iranian government has hailed Syria as the most important state in the front line opposing Israel. Fall of the Syrian regime is also seen in Tehran as a major boost to Israel's power, a country that has openly called for invading Iran and bringing about a regime change in Tehran. Finally, Tehran is concerned about Al-Qaeda, whose radical Sunni ideology and violent actions are against Iranian and indeed regional interests. Tehran sees continuation and escalation of the civil war in Syria as an ideal opportunity for Al-Qaeda to gain more presence and influence in the region. One can trace a gradual shift in Tehran's position vis-à-vis the Syrian crisis, especially since the election of President Hassan Rouhani in 2013 elections. To be certain, the shift reflects the changing realities of the Syrian crisis and the strategic and geopolitical considerations in the Middle East. Many in the Iranian leadership now have come to the conclusion that Syria cannot hold together as a stable and unified country as long as Assad is in power. 4 years into the war, no one expects Bashar al-Assad to regain his power and authority over all Syria. Tehran does not really care that much about Assad himself and his regime. The alliance with the Syrian regime since the Iraqi invasion of Iran in 1980 was not based on ideological considerations after all. The Ba'ath Party that has ruled Syria is both secular and socialist. At minimum, Tehran would like to see a government in Damascus that is not hostile to Iran. At maximum, it would rather have an ally that would be a partner and facilitate Tehran's policies in the region. Thank you.